The film begins by showing a male prisoner named Nato Niente, who has served several years in prison for a very serious crime. Nato is known to have murdered many people, including women and children, 371 times before finally turning himself into the police. At his last crime, killing a woman and a boy, he felt very guilty and decided to turn himself into the police. Several years after Nato served his prison term, he was finally released on parole by the police agency thanks to the help of one of his male colleagues, Carl Abrahams. Actually, many police officers hate Nato and are unhappy with his release because the crimes that he has committed are very heinous. They thought that dangerous people like him deserved life imprisonment. However, since they didn't have enough evidence, they could only convict him for a few years. It is still unknown whether Nato will become a better person or commit the same crime again after he is released from prison. But one thing is for sure, he is willing to do anything for his beloved 11-year-old son, Giulio. That day, when Nato got out of prison, he was picked up by Carl, one of his old friends closest to him. Carl is even willing to spend a lot of money to be able to free Nato from prison because he already owes a lot to Nato. On the way to the hotel where Nato will be staying, Carl immediately gives him everything he needs, from a cell phone, car, passport, and $30,000 so that he can start a new life. That night when Nato was stretching in the hotel room, he heard the alarm sound from his car, so he went out to check on the situation. Unfortunately, when he came out of his room, he was suddenly beaten and attacked by a group of police officers with repeated bats. Nato does not give any resistance or counterattack to the police because he realizes that the attack was just a trap to get him back into prison.
Wall hasn't changed you. Haven't changed you at all, have they?
The police officers hate him and think that people with dark pasts like him can never be forgiven. After the beating, Nato returned to his room and treated the bruises on his face and body. The next morning, Nato went to his ex-wife's house named Nadia to meet his son, Giulio, to unwind after being separated for years. When Giulio saw him who had been released from prison, he immediately ran to hug him with a happy feeling. Giulio was very happy with his presence, but when he learns that Nato won't be living together in the house, Giulio feels very disappointed. Giulio explains that their house situation has worsened when Nadia's boyfriend, Vincent, is always rude and often scolds them. Giulio added that Vincent did not hesitate to hit Nadia if she accidentally made a mistake. Shortly after, she asked Nato to hurry back to the hotel, considering that Vincent would return to their house soon. Before Nato left, he had time to take some photos of Giulio before he left the city. While looking at his photo, Nato remembered what Giulio said about Vincent, so he plans to find out about Vincent's real identity. In the evening, Nato goes to a bar owned by his old friend Bailarin, a famous gangster boss in Mexico. He asked Bailarin about the origins and background of Vincent. Bailarin told him that Vincent was a fairly successful property entrepreneur. Still, he also owned an illegal business and worked with drug cartel groups from southern Mexico in the field of arms smuggling. The next day, Nato decides to follow Nadia secretly to find out where Vincent's base is. After a long journey, they finally arrived at a long-abandoned factory, where she entered the factory to ask Vincent for a monthly fee. When Nato returned to his hotel, he found Giulio waiting for him in front of the hotel room. He immediately brought Giulio into the room to rest while seeing some pictures that Giulio had taken. In the afternoon, Nato drove Giulio back to Nadia's house before he finally went to a parking lot to eat some burgers in the car. While enjoying his dinner, Nato got a short message from Nadia telling him to stay away from Giulio because she knew he had many enemies that could endanger Giulio's safety. Nato reluctantly agreed to her request because he knew he couldn't be with Giulio all the time. Shortly after, a group of men suddenly appeared and surrounded Nato's car while pointing guns at him. Without feeling scared, he stared intently at the gang of thugs and immediately put up a fight when they fired shots. Even though he had to deal with several armed people at once, Nato could still defeat them all very easily. He even managed to blow up the car of one of the thugs who intended to escape from the place. In the evening, when Nato returns to the hotel, he gets a call from Giulio saying that their house is currently under attack. Hearing the news, he immediately rushed to drive his car to Nadia's house before something bad happened to Nadia and their son. Unfortunately, it was too late because, by the time he arrived, Nadia was already lying on the floor, covered in blood and lifeless. Shortly after, he realized that the perpetrator of this attack was her lover, Vincent, who intended to kidnap Giulio. One of Vincent's men immediately pointed a gun at Nato and threatened him not to put up any resistance. However, Nato could swiftly defeat him and snatch the gun from his hand before a gunfight broke out between them. Unfortunately, after Nato managed to defeat all of Vincent's men, Vincent had already gone to escape with Giulio. Shortly after Vincent's car left the place, the police officers started arriving and thought that Nato was the perpetrator of Nadia's murder. He had to run away from that place because the incident had made him a fugitive from the police again. That night, Nato again meets with Carl under the flyover to ask for help so that he can find Vincent, who is now kidnapping Julio. Carl, who has many connections with the gangsters, says that Nato can start the search by meeting one of Vincent's business partners named Jet Rink, an illegal arms dealer who gets supplies from Vincent. After getting some money and a car from Carl, Nato immediately rushed to the nightclub run by Jet Rink. While at the nightclub, he asks the female bartender, Inez, about Jet Rink's location. Then, she says he can ask Jet Rink's girlfriend, Kali, to take him to Jet Rink's house. After Nato gives some money to Kali, she finally agrees to take him to Jet Rink's house and introduce him to Jet Rink. When he arrived at Jet Rink's house, he pretended to be one of Vincent's clients assigned to conduct a survey of all the weapons owned by Jet Rink. Hearing those words, Jet Rink immediately realized that Nato had lied because Jet Rink was a close friend of Vincent's who knew for sure who was Vincent's client. When Jet Rink was about to open fire at him, he had already shot at Jet Rink's leg and stepped on the gunshot wound on purpose. After Nato managed to get information about the location of Vincent's whereabouts, he immediately took some of Jet Rink's money and left the house. Afterward, Nato returns to the nightclub to ask Inez for help pretending to be his wife so they can cross the Mexican state border to go to Vincent's hideout. Not long after, 3 young men suddenly attacked him, who was in the bathroom, but Nato could easily defeat them. After receiving a large amount of money, Inez decides to help him and pretends to be his wife. As he had previously predicted, they managed to pass the checkpoint at the border because the border police officers were too focused on Inez's sexy body. After they arrived at an inn, Nato allowed Inez to return home the next day because her task had been completed. However, after she discovered that his purpose in doing all this was to save his son, Inez was moved to help him further. With a fee double the previous agreement, Inez will try to dig up information from Vincent by seducing him while pretending to be buying an apartment. At the first meeting, she still couldn't get much information from him, but she still had a chance to find out more at their next meeting. The next night, when Inez meets with Vincent at his main headquarters for a drink, the unexpected happens. He suddenly slapped her and pointed a gun at her head because he knew she was actually approaching him on orders from someone. Fortunately, when Inez was in danger, Nato arrived on time and immediately killed every guard in Vincent's house before he finally beat and arrested Vincent. After handcuffing and tying him to a chair, Nato tortured Vincent viciously, pouring hot water on his legs and cutting his fingers and nails to burn his hands with embers.
Now we begin.
Don't you fucking do that! Don't you fucking do
Vincent, who was no longer strong with the torture, was forced to confess to Nato that he had sold Julio to a human trafficker named Suns, who was known to often kidnap famous people. Vincent confessed that he was forced to do all that because he had to earn a large amount of money to pay off his business debts. After hearing Suns' name, Nato immediately contacted Bailerin to find out where his human trafficking headquarters were. When Nato returns to the hotel, he advises Inez to return home because this task is too dangerous for her safety. However, it turns out that Inez still wants to help him so he can meet his only son. The next day when Nato and Inez were at Suns' boxing gym, he asked several men where Suns was. But unexpectedly, not long after arriving at the gym, several men beat him from behind and immediately kidnapped the 2 of them into the car. The car carrying Inez had left first, while the car carrying Nato had fallen far behind. Although his hands were handcuffed, he could easily beat Suns' men and take over the steering wheel to follow the car carrying Inez. After a long journey, Nato finally arrived at a hideout located in a forest area and found the location where Inez was being held together with other kidnapped victims. Unfortunately, Suns' men again managed to catch him and bring Nato in front of their boss, Suns. When Suns saw Nato's arrival, he immediately showed Julio, who was hanging upside down above a well filled with cold water. He then explains that the reason he bought Julio from Vincent was not a mere coincidence but part of his plan to take revenge on Nato. He wants to take revenge on Nato for the actions that Nato had done in the past, where he killed his wife and his son without any mercy. When witnessing the incident, Nato tried to rebel and put up a fight, making Suns' men angry and intending to kill him. But strangely, Suns killed his subordinates who almost killed Nato because he didn't want Nato to die before witnessing the death of his son. After all of Suns' men died, Suns approached Nato and forced him to watch Julio's body, which had died after being drowned for several minutes.
No, Dad!
With his remaining strength, Nato immediately killed Suns and freed all the hostages before finally carrying Julio's lifeless body. The next day, after Nato buried his beloved son with a proper burial, he opened the trunk of the car where he kept Bailerin. Turns out, Bailerin was the one who had leaked all the information about Nato and his family, including leaking information about Vincent and Giulio to Sons. After all the things that Nato went through, he finally had to return to his old life, where he had to continue killing and hurting others without mercy. This is the end of the film. The moral message that can be learned from this film is every crime we have ever committed in the past will always have big consequences where we can put our families in danger and lose our loved ones.